The year is 1347. A merchant ship docks in Sicily after a long voyage from the Black Sea. The crew stumbles off the vessel, covered in black boils, blood seeping from their skin, fever burning through their bodies. Most are already dead. Within days, the disease spreads through the port city. Within weeks, it consumes all of Sicily. Within months, it reaches mainland Europe. Within 5 years, it will kill between 75 and 200 million people, nearly half of Europe's entire population. They called it the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, the Black Death. It arrived without warning. It killed without mercy. It vanished without explanation. Entire villages were wiped out overnight. Cities became mass graves. Families watched each other die in agony, powerless to help. The social order collapsed. The economy shattered. Faith itself was tested. And then, just as mysteriously as it appeared, it stopped. But the screams never truly faded. This is the story of humanity's darkest pandemic, a plague so devastating it changed the course of civilization. A story of death, yes, but also of survival, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. And a warning, it could happen again. Before the plague, Europe was thriving. The medieval warm period had brought mild temperatures and abundant harvests. Population was booming. An estimated 75 million people lived in Europe by 1340. Trade routes connected Europe to Asia via the Silk Road. Goods, ideas, and culture flowed freely between civilizations. Cities were growing. Gothic cathedrals soared towards heaven. Universities flourished in Paris, Oxford, Bologna. But this prosperity concealed dangerous vulnerabilities. Medieval cities were overcrowded, unsanitary death traps. Streets filled with human waste and animal carcasses. Drinking water contaminated by sewage. Houses were built close together, wooden structures that shared walls, perfect for disease transmission. People bathed rarely. Medical understanding was primitive, based on the ancient Greek theory of humors, the belief that illness came from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They had no concept of germs, no understanding of contagion, no effective treatments for infectious disease. And then, with the rats. Medieval cities were infested with rodents, thriving in grain stores, garbage heaps, and dark corners of every building. These rats carried fleas, and those fleas carried death. The stage was set for catastrophe. All that was needed was the spark. In 1346, that spark ignited in the steppes of Central Asia. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, had existed in rodent populations for millennia, circulating among marmots and other burrowing animals in the grasslands of Central Asia. Normally, it stayed contained in these animal reservoirs. But in the 1340s, something changed. Climate fluctuations disrupted the ecosystem. Rodent populations exploded, then crashed. Fleas desperately sought new hosts. They found them in the rats that lived alongside human settlements along the Silk Road. And from rats, the disease jumped to humans. The plague spread along trade routes with terrifying speed. One of the earliest documented outbreaks occurred during the siege of Kaffa in 1346. Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula,
was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde, but the Mongol army itself was being decimated by plague. According to contemporary accounts, the Mongol commander ordered his men to catapult plague-infected corpses over the city walls, one of history's first documented uses of biological warfare. Whether this truly happened or is medieval propaganda, we don't know, but we know the result. Plague broke out in Kaffa. Genoese merchants fled by ship, carrying the disease with them. They sailed to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Venice, to Marseille. Everywhere they docked, death followed. The Black Death had arrived in Europe.
The disease manifested in 3 horrifying forms. Bubonic plague was most common, characterized by painful swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes of the neck, armpits, and groin. These buboes could grow to the size of an apple, turning black as the tissue died. The pain was excruciating. Victims developed high fever, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. Their skin turned dark purple or black from subcutaneous bleeding, hence the name Black Death. From infection to death, 3 to 7 days. Survival rate, roughly 40% if left untreated. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs. Victims coughed up blood-stained sputum. They could barely breathe. This form spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, like COVID-19. From infection to death, 2 to 3 days. Survival rate, nearly 0 without modern antibiotics. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims' extremities turned black and died, gangrene while still alive. They went into shock, their organs failing one by one. From infection to death, hours to 1 day. Survival rate, effectively 0. Contemporary accounts describe the horror vividly. Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, wrote, "How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, having breakfasted in the morning with their kinsfolk, comrades and friends, supped that same evening with their ancestors in the other world." The speed was incomprehensible. People went to bed healthy and were dead by morning. Families were destroyed in days. As the death toll mounted, medieval society unraveled. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unplowed. There was no one left to work them. Trade stopped. Markets closed. The economy collapsed. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves, plague pits, were dug on the edges of cities. In London, a single burial site at Smithfield held over 50,000 bodies, layer upon layer of corpses in communal trenches. The dead received no funerals, no prayers, no dignity. They were simply dumped and covered with lime. Survivors faced impossible choices. Doctors refused to treat patients. Many physicians fled cities entirely. Priests refused to administer last rites. The very men who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort abandoned their congregations. Families abandoned their sick, leaving them to die alone in locked rooms. Parents left children, children left parents, spouses fled from each other. The Italian poet Petrarch wrote, "O happy posterity, who will not experience such abysmal woe and will look upon our testimony as a fable." Some people responded to the chaos with hedonism. If death was inevitable, why not enjoy life's pleasures while you could? Boccaccio describes groups who locked themselves in houses with wine, food, and music, determined to die in luxury if they must die at all. Others turned to religious extremism. Bands of flagellants roamed Europe, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, believing the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. They marched from town to town, their backs shredded, chanting prayers and psalms. The Catholic Church eventually condemned them as heretics. And then there was the scapegoating. Fear and ignorance bred violence. Unable to understand the plague's true cause, people searched for someone to blame. They found scapegoats in the most vulnerable, Jewish communities. Across Europe, conspiracy theories spread that Jews were poisoning wells to cause the plague. The accusations were absurd. Jews were dying from plague at the same rates as Christians. But logic doesn't matter during mass hysteria. Pogroms erupted across Germany, France, and Spain. Entire Jewish communities were massacred. In Strasbourg, 900 Jews were burned alive. In mines, 6,000 were killed. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls condemning the violence, pointing out that Jews were dying from plague too. His words were ignored. Beggars, lepers, and foreigners were also targeted. Anyone perceived as other became suspect. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed compassion, reason, and humanity itself. But amidst the darkness, there were also glimmers of light. Not everyone fled. Some doctors stayed at their posts, treating patients despite the risks. Guy de Chauliac, physician to Pope Clement VI in Avignon, continued treating plague victims even after contracting the disease himself. He survived and documented his observations, providing valuable medical records. Some priests remained with their congregations, administering last rites and providing comfort to the dying. Many died for their dedication. In Muslim lands, Islamic scholars issued fatwas declaring that fleeing plague-stricken areas was permissible, but many chose to stay anyway. The famous Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta witnessed the plague in Damascus and wrote, "The people fasted for 3 days and went out to the mosque of the footprints in a vast concourse. The emirs, the sharifs, the judges, the soldiers, and the common people gathered there, and they spent Thursday night there in prayers and supplications." Ordinary people showed extraordinary courage. Neighbors cared for neighbors. Strangers took in orphaned children. Those who survived organized burial details, risking infection to give the dead some dignity. These acts of kindness, though overshadowed by the horror, reveal something profound about human nature. Even in the darkest times, compassion survives. Why did some people survive while others died? For centuries, this was a mystery. Medieval Europeans believed it was God's will, or punishment for sin, or bad air, miasma, rising from swamps and corpses. They tried everything to protect themselves. Physicians wore bizarre beaked masks filled with herbs and spices, believing pleasant scents would ward off disease. People carried posies of flowers, hence the nursery rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," which many believe references plague symptoms, though this is debated by historians. They burned incense, they prayed, they fled to the countryside. Nothing worked consistently. But modern science has uncovered the answers. First, genetics. Some people carry a genetic mutation called CCR5 delta 32, which provides resistance to plague bacteria. This mutation is most common in populations of European descent, likely because the Black Death acted as a selective pressure, killing those without the mutation and allowing survivors to pass it on. Second, prior exposure. People who had survived mild bacterial infections earlier in life sometimes had partial immunity. Third, random chance.
The plague killed indiscriminately, but transmission wasn't guaranteed. Avoiding fleas, rats, or people was largely luck. Fourth, isolation. Communities that quarantined early, sealing their borders, isolating the sick, had better survival rates. The city of Milan enforced draconian quarantine measures, walling up infected houses with the sick and healthy inside. It was brutal, but Milan's death rate was significantly lower than other Italian cities. The concept of quarantine itself comes from this period. Quaranta means 40 in Italian, referring to the 40 days ships were required to wait before docking in Venice. These measures worked, though medieval people didn't understand why.
By 1353, the worst was over. The Black Death had killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people worldwide, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. Entire regions were depopulated. Villages stood empty, slowly reclaimed by nature. But the survivors faced a radically transformed world. Economically, with half the workforce dead, labor became valuable. Peasants demanded higher wages. Feudal lords lost power. This shift accelerated the decline of feudalism and sowed the seeds for the Renaissance and the eventual rise of capitalism. Socially, the church's authority was shaken. People had prayed for deliverance, and their prayers went unanswered. This crisis of faith contributed to later reform movements and the Protestant Reformation. Medically, the plague forced physicians to question ancient theories. Observation began to replace dogma. The foundations of modern medicine, quarantine, public health measures, and empirical observation emerged from the ashes of the Black Death. Artistically, the trauma found expression in art. The dance of death motif appeared across Europe, skeletons dancing with the living, reminding everyone that death comes for rich and poor alike. Literature, painting, and music became darker, more introspective, more aware of mortality. Psychologically, survivors carried deep trauma. An entire generation grew up surrounded by death. But they also rebuilt. They married, had children, planted crops, constructed new buildings. Humanity demonstrated its most remarkable trait: resilience. The plague returned in waves over the next centuries: 1361, 1369, 1374, though never as severe as the initial outbreak. It wasn't until the 19th century that scientists finally identified the cause, Yersinia pestis, named after Alexander Yersin, who discovered it in 1894. The Black Death feels like ancient history, but it's not. Plague still exists. Every year, the World Health Organization reports thousands of plague cases, primarily in Africa, Asia, and South America. In 2017, Madagascar experienced a pneumonic plague outbreak that infected over 2,300 people. In the United States, cases occur annually in rural areas of the Southwest, where infected rodents still live. The difference now, we have antibiotics. Streptomycin, gentamicin, and doxycycline can cure plague if caught early. But antibiotic-resistant strains are emerging. And then there's COVID-19. The parallels are haunting. A disease emerging from animal reservoirs, spreading along trade routes, now airline routes, overwhelming healthcare systems, mass death, economic collapse, social upheaval. Conspiracy theories, scapegoating, denial and panic existing side by side. Heroic healthcare workers risking their lives, communities coming together to support each other, quarantines, masks, social distancing. We faced the same challenges our ancestors did 6 centuries later, and we responded in remarkably similar ways,
both the noble and the shameful. COVID-19 killed over 7 million people officially, likely far more. It was devastating, but it was not the Black Death. Yet it reminds us pandemics are not relics of the past. They are recurring features of human existence. The next one could be worse, or we could be better prepared. What does the Black Death teach us? First, nature is powerful and indifferent. Bacteria, viruses, and parasites don't hate us. They're simply following their biological imperatives. Our survival depends on science, preparation, and cooperation. Second, public health measures work. Quarantine, isolation, hygiene. These tools saved lives in 1347, and they save lives today. We ignore them at our peril. Third, scapegoating is dangerous and stupid. Blaming vulnerable populations for disease doesn't stop the disease, it only multiplies the suffering. Fourth, inequality kills. The poor always suffer most in pandemics. They live in crowded conditions, have less access to healthcare, and can't afford to isolate. A just society invests in public health for everyone, not just the wealthy. Fifth, resilience is human. We endure, we adapt, we rebuild. The generation that survived the Black Death went on to create the Renaissance, one of history's most creative and dynamic periods. From unimaginable darkness came extraordinary light. Sixth, we must listen to science. Medieval Europeans attributed the plague to divine punishment, astrological alignments, and miasma. They were wrong, and millions died because of that ignorance. We have knowledge they lacked. We have no excuse for rejecting it. Imagine the last person to die from the Black Death. Maybe a child in a small village, maybe an elder in a bustling city. Did they know they were the last? Did they understand that the great dying was finally ending? Probably not. To them, death was as random and meaningless as it had been for everyone else. But to us, looking back, that death marked a turning point. Humanity had survived. Not unchanged, not unscathed, but alive. Every person reading this, watching this, is a descendant of plague survivors. Your ancestors endured the worst pandemic in human history. They watched their worlds collapse. They buried their loved ones. They faced unimaginable loss. And they kept going. That resilience is in your DNA. The silent screams of the Black Death echo through history, but so do the voices of those who survived, who rebuilt, who refused to let death have the final word. We carry their strength, and we'll need it, because history doesn't end. Pandemics will come again. The question is, will we be ready? The Black Death killed nearly half of Europe. It shattered the medieval world and gave birth to the modern one. They are natural phenomena that we can understand, predict, and fight. We have tools our ancestors lacked: vaccines, antibiotics, epidemiology, public health infrastructure. But we also have the same vulnerabilities: inequality, misinformation, fear, and denial. The next pandemic could kill millions, or it could be contained quickly. The difference will be determined by the choices we make now. The screams of the past echo as a warning. Will we listen